Welcome to Leadership Explored, the podcast where we dive into what it really means to lead in today's world. I'm Ed Schaefer, joined as always by my co-host Andy Siegmund. Today we're talking about something leaders often overlook but shapes everything: language. Because the words we choose as leaders don't just communicate ideas, they shape relationships, guide behavior, and reinforce culture. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally. So today, we're unpacking how language influences trust, alignment, and the way people experience leadership. From subtle metaphors to the scripts we inherit, your words either build a stronger culture or slowly erode it. So Andy, what kind of leadership language have you seen leave a lasting impact, good or bad, on a team?
So I think the best example of like leadership language that I've seen was during my time at Amazon. I think everyone who'd be interested in this podcast is probably pretty familiar with the idea of their leadership principles. And one of the things that was really cool that they did is they would integrate those leadership principles into everyday conversation as well as all of their document writing. And those leadership principles were never changed in the sense that deliver results was never deliver the results. It was always deliver results, right? And it became this shorthand for everything you kind of knew within the culture. And it became a way that you would thank people. So Ed, thank you for taking ownership here, right? So one LP was just simply ownership, or displaying ownership, right? So it would be a good shorthand for compliments, but it would also be a really effective way to provide constructive guidance, and feedback. Ed, I need you to take more ownership here, or Ed, I appreciate your ownership, but what I'm not seeing is your ability to follow through and deliver results. Right, just using the kind of most obvious ones. And I found that to be really useful, right? Because it was a shorthand to understand exactly what we were meaning, and it kind of created this cohesive fabric within the culture where everyone was using really ubiquitous language to talk about the same things, generally speaking. Curious, Ed, how about you? You have good, bad examples?
Yeah, well, I love that you started with a good kind of positive example, because I think a lot of what we call leadership communication winds up ultimately just being kind of performance. It's almost corporate theater in a lot of ways. I think there's common signs when that's happening, things like vague, jargony phrases. We hear things like, oh, finding efficiencies or shifting priorities or realigning resources. And most of the time, those terms or phrases are just sanitized ways to avoid saying what's actually happening: layoffs or budget cuts, people losing access to benefits or other things that they had before. And I think a lot of people will use that kind of language because they think it seems strategic, but I think it creates distance and I think it erodes trust. People are pretty smart most of the time, and I think any company I've worked in, or when somebody else I talk to is at a company who's going through something they don't know what the details are, people know what's really going on. Rumors spread, or you can kind of read in between the lines or read the writing on the wall. Um, and when you use that kind of language, I think the people stop believing that leadership is going to ever tell them the truth or say what's happening out loud. And once people stop trusting what you say, then they're going to stop engaging with what you mean. And when they stop believing your words, then it's going to be really hard to lead them anywhere. So I think it's really important we kind of tackle this leadership language and leadership communication thing every day in our leadership and working with different people. So I guess, what do you think about that? Have you seen that kind of thing where the words sound polished, but the meaning is either missing or completely disconnected from reality?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a pretty ubiquitous problem, right? There are like entire personalities on like TikTok and threads and whatnot that are dedicated to either translating to or translating from corporate jargon, right? Let's circle back to this, or we need to find efficiencies, or do less with more, right? All these kind of buzzwordy things. And you know, I, I think when deployed judiciously, they work as effective shorthand, but you're right in calling out that there's a risk that you're either being insincere or indirect, or you might just not have the depth of knowledge, right? When we were working together, I think we would joke about, shifting left in the DevOps department, and like just kind of like all of the different buzzwords that you could drop into like one singular sentence that essentially had no actual meaning, right? And I think that that's really common, and that's a trap that we can fall into. We can really undermine trust with your organization by just being too jargon oriented, and never even getting to the point. But then on the flip side, and I do try to want to be the, maybe I'm good cop in this conversation, Ed. But there are some more sanitized versions of things that I think are nicer, or I think are effective, right? So like, for example, I would rather we talk about a reduction in force than we talk about a layoff. It is the exact same thing. I don't think either one of them is clear or clearer, but I think talking about a reduction in force feels less personal, or feels a little bit more gentle than saying we're going through layoffs right now, right? And I think that there's all sorts of different things, where there is something that's maybe jargony, or whatever, that is an effective usage of things.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think the the example you gave, reduction in force, isn't covering anything up, really. It's just a different, maybe slightly sanitized phrase for layoffs. Whereas the finding efficiencies, well, what does that mean? Are we saving money on licenses, or are we reducing overhead in these areas, or moving to the cloud? Or does that mean we're,
We're AIing the AI now to find efficiencies in the left shift department.
yeah. Well, yeah, I love your example, the idea of that, like that the shifting left, and when we heard that, and I think that's a good call out for the fact that what we say, especially as leaders, it doesn't just live in the moment. It's not like the point in time when we say it and that's it. The words have a way of echoing, or kind of transition, going out throughout the organization. Maybe you say something once at an all hands meeting, and before long you hear it echoed in team meetings, or in performance reviews, or even in the Slack channels. And I know the example you gave, we were kind of poking at it in jest, but I've certainly seen that sort of thing happen where it's people are using it in a serious way. I can think of some examples, like I've seen emails that were addressed to winners, and I think the unspoken flip side of that, whether the person intended it or not, is, does that mean that some people are losers? Does that mean people not on our team in the company, or people outside of our company, are just not winners? Or there's when a leader says we're family, and then they later have to lay people off. A lot of companies say we're family, and they talk about family and we treat each other like family, but then they lay people off, or they make tough calls, and that metaphor is backfired hard, right? You're not going to lay off your family. And that phrase, it sets an emotional expectation that feels almost personally violating when it's broken. Or in agile and leadership, I've seen terms that get turned into buzzwords or rituals. So like with agile, they are saying the right thing, but they don't live it. They call everything a retro or a stand up when it's not really serving that purpose. So I think we need to watch out for how words can become rituals at the organization, or how the language we use can become culture. And sometimes it can happen overnight, like really quickly when you don't expect it. And sometimes it can happen by accident. Maybe you just said something offhand, and all of a sudden it's a phrase that everybody's using when you didn't even mean to. So, Andy, I know we've both seen language take on more weight than it was probably meant to. How do you think leaders can be more intentional about noticing when that starts to happen?
Yeah, so I think there's a good opportunity to talk about what I like to call ubiquitous language. So you mentioned a handful of agile terms, right? We both have pretty strong backgrounds in that, yeah, methodology, if you will. And when you teach those courses, right, you do sort of certifications, you talk about ubiquitous language, and part of it is it's sort of like the leadership principles example that I shared at the beginning, right? Is we want to have, if we're talking about a retrospective, I want my definition of a retrospective to be the same as your definition of a retrospective. And I think that as time progresses in any sort of organization, and this could be a work organization, this could even be your family, right? All things are subject to entropy, right? So that brand dilution is inevitable if we don't actively control and work against that overall entropy. So I think it's really important to continuously reset those definitions as you start to see the definition of, say, a retrospective shifting over time. As a leader, you have to kind of bring that back to what you originally intended or what you're intending of it now. And I think we just need to be really cautious about how that dilution happens. And one of the things, especially if you're a new leader coming in, one of the things that could be really effective is just simply defining things out of the gate. Hey, we're going to talk about this, and this is how we define it in this context. Or if you're working on a team, right, not being afraid to be the person that doesn't know something, right? I think it's a Seneca line of like, a man cannot learn that which he thinks he already knows, right? Ask somebody to define a thing. It can be really powerful, and it's a really good way to have a conversation. I was listening to a podcast not too long ago, and the guest was like, by all accounts, a much more successful businessman than the host. And they were talking about business things. He said, hold on, stop. Let's define these terms before we continue in the conversation. That way we're having the same conversation. And I just thought that that was like a brilliant display of humility and a display of level setting within the context of a conversation, to make sure that when I say chair and you say chair, we're talking about a chair. Right. So that's I that to me is, I think, where you really need to be intentional and effective and deliberate. I think you're.
Yeah, I love that, and I know you know I love the term ubiquitous language. I think I originally gathered that from around domain-driven design principles, and I know we talked in the
Mm,
past about, well, that's semantics, but sometimes semantics do actually matter, or they do have an impact or affect things a little bit, and making sure that we do understand what we mean when they say those things. And just using the agile example again, quarterly planning at one company could be a very different thing than what quarterly planning means when you're at a different company, or how they're
mhm,
loaded, or what kind of feelings or emotions are behind them. So
mhm,
I think that's a great point, and I think this is actually also a really good lead into something around semantics a little bit, and something I think about a lot, which is pronouns. They might seem small in a lot of cases, but I think they signal a lot. And when we're talking about pronouns in this context, I'm just meaning I, you, and we for the most part. I'm sure there are others that we could think of, but it's something we notice sometimes when leaders they say I for their successes and you for problems. And I think when that happens, people notice. And it creates this kind of culture of blame and self promotion where the leader saying, like, well, all the successes are a result of me and my impact, but all the failures have nothing to do with me and they're all related to you. Or maybe it's not so harsh as saying you, but I have definitely encountered leaders who they say we for the failures when something didn't go according to plan. Oh, we missed this or we didn't accomplish that. But whenever things are going well, they talk about all the great things they did. Oh, I did this, or I made sure this happened and that allowed this to happen. And again, I think all that does is subtly, or maybe not so subtly, signal to the people in the company: the wins are mine, the problems are yours. And if we flip that on the other side, or on the other hand, good pronouns build shared ownership. When we say things
mhm.
like we, and we're talking about direction or alignment, I think it helps people feel like they're all in it together and their opinion matters. And it's not just one person's voice or opinion. It's the whole group. Um, and the same you generally, if you're pointing a finger and saying you did this or you failed or whatever, that's not going to be very good. But you can be empowering, or distancing, just depending on the context. There's a big difference between if I came to you and said you need to get this fixed or this is your problem, or if I came to you and said, hey, what support do you need to be able to solve this, or to get through this blocker or accomplish this thing. So I think how we use pronouns is one of the clearest tells for whether a leader sees themselves as part of the team or above it. So, Andy, have you ever seen someone else or caught yourself defaulting to unhelpful pronouns, or have you seen how shifting them changes team dynamics?
Yeah, this is a great call out, Ed, and I'm going to reference something a little oblique, but I swear I'll circle it up. As you know, I'm a rabid ice hockey fan. And there's a show that's been out for a handful of seasons. It's called Shoresy, and basically it's Canadian Ted Lasso, but it's ice hockey. It's probably the shortest way to put it, but it's also less friendly and much more lewd. And in one of the scenes, they're talking with the owner of the team, and they're asking her why she loves hockey so much. And for context, she owns like a little regional senior hockey club, right? So that this, if you were to make like the soccer analogy, this would be a Canadian ice hockey team that is smaller than Wrexham when Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney originally bought Wrexham, right? So it's pretty small podunk kind of thing. And so yeah, she's in it for the love of the game, not for the economics of the game. And she responded with something, and I'm paraphrasing here, but she was saying that, when you talk to hockey players, when you see them interview after the game, and I found this to be true all the way up through the NHL level, when things go wrong, they take all of the blame on themselves. I didn't play well. I made this mistake. I did this. I'm taking ownership of this defeat or this breakdown or what have you. And when things go really well, they do the exact opposite. So you see somebody score this fantastic goal, and it's, oh, well, so and so, found me on open ice and just delivered the perfect pass, and all I had to do was tap it in,
Yeah.
right? Or the so and so, the goaltender was standing on his head, and so what they do is they take all the blame and then they take none of the credit. And one, I think that directionally that's usually correct for ice hockey, which is a really interesting cultural quirk of ice hockey. But I think as a leader in an organization, I think it's a really good standard to set, right? Where, if you're leading a group, you should deflect the wins to your team and take the losses yourself, right? Um, and this again, it's a broad strokes that we're painting with. I'm not saying that this applies to absolutely everything, but I think in practice, it's really good for building team cohesion and really like using those pronouns effectively. Oh well, you know, Ed did all of the legwork for the call that we're doing. All I had to do was show up and take the volleys that he threw my way, right? Those sorts of things. I think that can be really, really effective to use those pronouns in a way that's constructive. And I think that when you flip it the other way, you're probably on a slippery slope. Now, of course, it's totally different if, say, you're interviewing for a job. Don't use we language. Use a lot of I language. But yeah, that's the way I like to think about things in that context.
Yeah. No, I love that. I think that's great. And I always have appreciated leaders I have who do that when I'm on a team. And when I've done that for people I'm leading, I generally feel like they appreciate it, or I hear things that they appreciated after the fact. So, um, yeah, I think that's a great point. And yeah, I'll second. We are speaking with broad strokes here, and we're talking about leadership. So there is obviously a dark side to some of that, where if you're always taking all of the blame on yourself for things that weren't your fault or out of your control, maybe that's like a time to visit a therapist and get some support that way or something. But in the context of leadership, when you're in that position of power and leading the organization, I think, yeah, I fully agree. Taking the wins and dispersing them to the team, or giving that credit to the team, and taking the losses and trying to take as much ownership as you can, I think is a really powerful position. Um, so yeah, well, we talked about the pronouns, and then I guess a similar kind of concept that we wanted to talk about is around metaphors. And metaphors might actually be even more powerful than the pronouns, because I think that they can frame how people interpret their work or the cultural context and things like that. So I've worked with orgs or inside of organizations where the dominant metaphors were all combat or like war based metaphors: crush the competition, or we're going to go to war over this, or we're going to attack them, or we're going to knock them down so they can't get back up, or things like that. And I think those type of metaphors are risky or dangerous because it can create some heightened aggressive energy. Sometimes it creates combativeness inside of the organization where people are competing with each other instead of thinking in a teamy kind of way. And I think that kind of culture can wear people out and pit people against each other. But then I've also seen how powerful it can be when leaders use metaphors around building or growing or navigating. Um, I think a lot about the almost like the farm metaphors where I can't force plants to grow, just like I can't force my employees to grow, but I could set them up with the right environment, the soil. I can make sure that they're spaced properly and in the right locations. And sometimes some plants they benefit each other, so you want those close together where other ones compete, and you want
Mhm.
to keep them separate. You want to get the weeds out of the garden, things like that. So I think metaphors like that can be really powerful. And then I personally, I use a lot of outdoor metaphors from my background doing a lot of hiking and mountaineering and climbing, because I think that the way we travel and move in the outdoors and plan our trips and all those kind of things, and then actually go try to summit the mountain, I think they're very similar to the types of things that we experience, right? Where we need to like orient ourselves and navigate, and we need to, just take it one step at a time or one handhold at a time, or, stay on the trail, or like, oh, the trail might
Don't get
be,
summit fever.
yeah, things like that. So I think that those types of metaphors are really good because they shift the mindset more into that collaboration, preparation, and endurance. So when we use metaphors, it's not just about describing the work, but I do think it shapes how people think about it and how they approach it. So are there any metaphors that you can think of that you've seen leaders use, and what kind of behaviors or outcomes have those metaphors encouraged or discouraged?
Yeah. So, and I think the war metaphor is an apt one. You see a lot of sports metaphors, which are not super dissimilar. I think it's also worth kind of remembering the genesis of a lot of that, right? A lot of the industries that we work in remain male dominated, or at least are historically male dominated. So I think those metaphors
Hmm.
are kind of a relic of a trickle down, right? Generations ago, it would be rare for you as a man to be working with people who hadn't fought in some war, right? It was a pretty ubiquitous experience, and obviously, as our societies have changed over the intervening centuries, the percentage of adult men who've experienced combat has gone down significantly. Um, so one of the things, you're talking about like gardening or like outdoor stuff, and I think that this brings up kind of another sort of oblique topic that, like, one of the things that I think is invaluable to leaders generally is having breadth of life experience. So being able to relate to a breadth of different things, right? Knowing enough about sports or history or outdoors things or fixing up a house or just like various experiences that people have, like that most people would have, and being able to pull those metaphors out of your toolbox for your audience, as it suits, right? So I don't think metaphors are a bad thing by any means. I don't think any of these metaphors are inherently negative things to use. I think the main thing is making sure that we don't use the same types of metaphors all the time, or when we're using those metaphors, making sure that they're appropriate for the audience that you're speaking to, or that you're trying to lead, right? If you're a leader in the military, you probably want to use a lot of military metaphors, but you also probably want to really know your history, so you make sure you get them absolutely correct. If you're working with a much more diverse group, you want to kind of move through different metaphors pretty seamlessly, make a sports metaphor, a war metaphor, gardening metaphor, an outdoors metaphor, a home improvement metaphor, a raising kids metaphor, a raising pets metaphor, right? Making sure that you kind of cover those bases. And I think the only way you can do that is to have a breadth of experience yourself, whether that's just you trying to live an interesting life where you get out, or at least like reading a lot so you can pull from a whole bunch of different things to make those work and be effective.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great call out. I think and I do agree. I think using lots of metaphors can be helpful, and just being aware of what the potential implications or impact of the metaphors that you're using are. I know I've been, sometimes I've caught myself starting to use a metaphor, and then partway through I'll say, well, let's say I use a war metaphor. I'm like, well, I'm not saying we're, I'm not trying to say we're combating these people, but uh, or whatever. And I'll sort of hedge it a little bit just to take some of the potential weight or implications out of it if that wasn't really what I was intending. And I think you mentioned the sports metaphors. I think a lot of sports metaphors, which there's a lot of teamwork and things that are built into those that can be pretty good. But there's also competition built into those. So if you're using teamwork
Mhm.
or if you're using sports metaphors internally about your team, that might cause increased competition. And I love the point you made about making sure that the metaphors you use are able to resonate with your audience. I'm sure I'm not alone in this, having heard someone who's somebody who's extremely wealthy, like a billionaire, using a metaphor that is completely unrelatable to anyone but the people like that, or maybe a
I I I remember my father talking about some quip that Obama made 20 years ago, there 15 years ago, whatever the heck it was at this point, where he said, I think the line was, "Well, I eat arugula just like the next guy," and like just how out of touch that was, and like the mid aughts of like, no, like everyone does not eat arugula.
yeah. Or I know a lot of leaders talk about golf, but not a lot of their employees probably have opportunities to play golf or have that as an
Yeah,
interest. So using that as your metaphor may kind of fall flat.
yeah,
Um,
it can increase distance when you're trying to close distance. Yeah, I think that's a really good reminder. Um,
yeah,
yeah. Well, I was talking to my housekeeper the other day, and
sure. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's about alignment, being aligned with who you're communicating with and what you're trying to say, and then making sure you understand it. Um, and it's not just about what you say; it's also about whether your words and your actions line up with each other. Uh, if a company says we value work-life balance, but then they reward all-nighters and 60-hour work weeks, they might say we value work-life balance, but the real message is clear. They want you to work and they don't care about your home life balance. And in that case, it doesn't matter how well written your values statement is or how much you care about employees. Your words are not aligning with your actions. Same with a company can say we care about mental health, or I could say that as an individual. But then again, if you're praising people for working weekends or sending Slack messages at 10 p.m., the culture is telling a different story. And you can say we value diversity, but if your promotion and hiring decisions never reflect that, people are going to notice and they're going to lose trust fast. So I think the language we use and the language that we um, share with people, it creates expectations, but actions ultimately reinforce the meaning. I think one of the biggest failures I see in leadership is assuming that good intentions and polished language is going to be enough to fill those gaps. But if the language is not aligned with the behavior, it just becomes noise, or maybe even hypocrisy. And when your language and your leadership behavior don't match, it might even be worse than hypocrisy. I would say in some ways it can be active culture erosion, because you're
Mhm.
saying one thing but doing a different thing, and now you've got words that say to behave a way, but then you've got behaviors and culture that are going to permeate through the organization that are the opposite of that. And I think trust is built when people see consistency between what leaders say and what they do. And if that alignment is missing, it doesn't matter how well meaning your message is, or how well polished it is, or how many communication people you worked with to make sure it was just right. Those messages are going to be dismissed or distrusted or just be, meaningless to people. They'll stop trusting both your words and the intent behind it if it's misaligned and doesn't show that you're actually trying to do the things you say. Have you ever seen any cases where misalignment between language and action show up in an organization? And do you have any ideas on how you could catch yourself, or how you would recommend a leader catch themselves before they slip into that trap?
Yeah, I mean, it happens all the time, right? We value transparency, and then there is no transparency, or we value honesty, and then there's a lot of back channeling and kind of subterfuge. Um, you know, I think I think the key point here is remembering that behavior is language, right? And and I think that it's worth it to be cognizant of that from a leadership point of view, but also just I think from a humanistic point of view, right? Behavior is language, behavior is communication. And I think that we just want to be cautious about that, right? If you're going to say something, does your behavior live up to it? Because behavior is what people are really going to see. Being consistent is really, really critical, and just understanding what it is that you're trying to do, right? And also remembering that intent doesn't create change, right? Intent is useless. Mechanisms are what actually make things happen, right? So you can have all the good intentions in the world, but if you don't follow through on those intentions, it's like the tree that falls in the forest, right? And I think a lot of folks get caught up in that. Oh, like, well, I I want to have a diverse organization, but you don't implement anything to increase your diversity, right? Or we want people to log off at 6 p.m., but you don't make that you remain understaffed, right? Or you yourself continue to work 12 or 14-hour days, right? So just remembering that action is actually what matters, and the words should follow the action rather than the other way around.
Yeah, that's great. Well, cool. I guess let's move in to talking about how we can upgrade the language that we use as leaders. And I don't mean that in a buzzword bingo kind of way, but maybe in a more meaningful or cultural way. I think one easy place to start is the repeated scripts that we use. It might be performance reviews or unfortunately layoff announcements, holiday thank yous, quarterly messages or leadership updates, things like that. I think a lot of those that I've seen, at least the emails I receive, they sound like they're written by legal or a copywriter or just copied from last year. A lot of times they lack humanity. When you say thank you for your hard work and enjoy your well earned time off at the end of the year, it might seem fine, but I feel like you're kind of signaling that rest is something you earn through productivity and that people who didn't over deliver, maybe like, should they not feel proud for the work that they did because they didn't over deliver? Or I know we talk about this a lot, or this phrase comes up a lot when someone is called a rock star or a hero for working late or saving a last minute deadline. It subtly tells everyone else the recognition only comes if you burn yourself out. And like we mentioned earlier, we both made the intentional shift away from saying you guys to something more inclusive. It took practice, but it stuck and it made a difference. One that I'm still catching myself is the word just. It downplays difficulty. Saying things like just ping them or just make a quick update can make the other person feel like work isn't real or meaningful. So I catch myself using that a lot. Oh, just do this or just do that, and it's like, well, wait a sec. Maybe just makes it sound like it's easy or trivial, and it's not always like that. Um, we can't script everything we're going to say or plan. Maybe if we have repeating ones that we need to send out regularly or things that we meetings or conversations we have all the time, we might be able to. But I don't think we can script them out all the time. So I think a big thing about this would be just slow down and try to notice in yourself, what am I trying to say? What assumptions does the language or the phrase or the metaphor I'm using carry? What might it imply about how I'm thinking about things? And what might I be reinforcing without realizing it? And if you kind of take those steps as you maybe catch yourself just using language without ever thinking about it, it may help you catch some things that should be adjusted, or maybe that would help you um, get your intent out more clearly without using language that doesn't have the same meaning that you're hoping for. Are there any language patterns or habitual phrases that you think leaders should pause and reflect on?
Yeah, I really like that, like the call out of just. And I think that that's one of those things that's also kind of a double-edged sword, because you can run that risk of, say, diminishing somebody else's effort. Like, hey, I just need you to do XYZ. But I think you can also lighten the lift if it's something that you're doing, right? So, Ed, if you come to me with a problem, it's like, oh yeah, I just need to do XYZ, right? Now this problem that you think is super heavy, you're bringing to me because you think it's super heavy, and I'm showing you that bringing it to me is not a big deal, right? So like for me, solutioning this is easier for me than it may have been for you, and like that's why you brought me the problem in the first place. Right. I think especially when you think about, direct leadership sort of thing. So I think it can be useful to kind of maybe downplay certain severity, especially when people are freaking out, or if it's an escalation of sorts of things. So just remembering how your language plays with that. But I think what you're getting at, or the core piece of what you're getting at, is just being thoughtful and intentional, and trying to not always rely on, your default operating system for all of your kind of communication there. And I think that that's a really good point.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think all of this ties back to probably the number one or most important leadership capability or power that we need to grow and develop, which is self-awareness. Um, a while ago, you and I had both made that shift away from saying you guys because we were on a team that wasn't just guys, and we realized it wasn't inclusive, and it was sort of exclusive in some ways, and it was a pretty small change. I know we normally use y'all or folks, or maybe everyone now, but it was
Yeah.
still hard
Team.
to, yeah, or team. So it was a small change, but it didn't come fully naturally, even though we had great intentions behind it and we really wanted to do it. It took a little time for us to make that shift. Um, and when we even said, hey, if we accidentally say guys, just let it, hey, could you call us out or just remind us so that we reinforce that. And it didn't really feel that painful to me. It felt pretty easy to do. And I wasn't concerned about, oh, I'm policing my language for someone else. It was really about thinking about our team and what it implied and making sure everyone there felt welcome and inclusive. And I think it did. I think it really helped shape a more welcoming team culture and made everyone feel like they were part of the team, and we weren't excluding anyone. And like I just mentioned a little bit ago, I try to watch for the word just. It's just,
Hmm.
I just did it. It's just so easy to say, and it can come off all on any situation, but it does sometimes come off like you're minimizing the work or making it sound like something should be simple. Um, and maybe I think that it would be potentially simple, but that doesn't mean you've ever done it before or that it's simple for you or you have the same ability to do it as I do. So I wouldn't want to minimize it or make you feel like your capabilities aren't as good as mine because for me it's a something I just do and it's something that you have
Yeah.
to work on. Um, yeah, so none of us gets this stuff perfect. But if we want to grow as leaders, we have to grow in all sorts of ways, and I think that includes the way we use language. Because as we've been talking about, our words create more than impressions; they create momentum. So aside from guys, is there any shift that you made or that you've seen someone else make that surprised you with how big of a difference it made?
Yeah. This is one I've been working on for a while in my career. And I think in our it was maybe our intro episode, I mentioned working with a conductor who mentioned to his student, right, that if you're going to sing something, you've got to sing it correctly, right? You've got to do it correctly. You can't do this incorrectly in front of the group because you're going to undermine yourself in that. And I think that that's also tangentially related to removal of what are colloquially known as weasel words, right? So a weasel word is any generic term that can be replaced with concrete data. And the reason I think that this is super effective is when you can replace something with concrete data, you're showing that the thing you're talking about has been fully thought through. If we do XYZ, we will increase revenue a lot. Well, a lot's a weasel word. What the heck is a lot? A lot doesn't mean anything. If we do XYZ, we'll increase revenue by one, two, three. Much more powerful statement and a much more cohesive thing. So it's harder to do on the fly unless you just happen to have, a giant backpack full of concrete data that you can reference. But I think when you're talking about things that are within your specific domain, especially when you're crafting emails or RFPs or any of those sorts of things, making sure that you're specific and accurate and data oriented really accelerates the trust curve in my experience, and also presents you as much more authoritative and much more knowledgeable. And you can also do it with ranges, right? When we find that when we implement this system, we see a 25 to 35% increase in efficiency as defined by ABCDEFG, right? This is going to make you way more efficient, right? One of those statements is a much more powerful and effective statement than the other. And I think that as we grow in our leadership journeys, effectivity is something that we really need to focus on. And this is, in my experience, a good way to accelerate that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I think that's what this episode really has been trying to be all about, is just us realizing that language isn't just the surface level polish. It is foundational. It's the invisible architecture of how we lead. Language is leadership. And it's not just how we sound, it's what we reinforce, what we normalize, and what we're building. Our words shape behavior. It influences how safe people feel, and it either reinforces clarity or contributes to confusion. So much of culture happens in the margins of the communication that we do. So here's our challenge to you, the listener, this week. Take a look at the language you use most often, the phrases you repeat, the metaphors that show up in your emails, your meetings, your feedback. Ask yourself, do these reflect the kind of culture that I want to build? And do these reflect the type of leader that I'd like to be? And if not, don't beat yourself up. Just know that you have that new awareness and work on starting to adjust. And you can do it one word at a time. And that's how leadership changes too. So thanks for exploring leadership with us on Leadership Explored today. If today's episode got you thinking differently about how you lead, we'd love to hear from you. You can connect with us on LinkedIn or email us at leadershipexplored@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you and get your letters or your thoughts and maybe some ideas on future topics that we should cover. If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe and share it with someone else who leads. We release new episodes every other Tuesday. Until next time, keep leading with purpose.